Want to transform your battlefield into a jaw-dropping, eye-popping masterpiece? It's easier than you might think. Hey everyone, David the War Boss from Dadhammer back for another video, and today we're going to show you how to take your terrain game to the next level with some quick and easy steps that anyone can perform. This tutorial will primarily be for those that already have some terrain, specifically ruined buildings, from a company like Games Workshop or another manufacturer online. However, this can also apply to your homemade terrain or potentially some that you have 3D printed. Now, if you're currently on the fence about buying or maybe building some terrain, I highly encourage you do because it definitely elevates the immersion of your Warhammer games. I covered this also in a previous video regarding top 5 accessories for new players, so make sure to check that out if you want to learn more. Now, before we start the tutorial, make sure to hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell so you don't miss any future content from Dadhammer, as we'll be covering more painting tutorials in the weeks to come. With that said, grab your brushes, your paints, and let's turn that blank canvas into something that your opponents will be in awe of. So this is the piece of ruined kit that we're going to be focusing the tutorial on today. This comes from a Games Workshop product called the Sector Imperialis Ruins, and it comes in a box, and there's some other ruined pieces that come along with it. But this is going to be the focus of the tutorial for today. Now, the good thing about this tutorial is that it can really apply not just to Warhammer 40,000 or even a Games Workshop product, but I've got here a 3D printed house that I have put on the table for Age of Sigmar primarily, but you could also use it for Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that. The point, though, is that this tutorial with the dry brushing techniques and some of the other things I'm going to show you can be applied to a multitude of terrain pieces, so keep that in mind as you're watching. Now, one thing I wanted to state up front is even though I'm a huge fan of terrain, I think it looks great on the tabletop. It really enhances my games personally, but the terrain is really just a frame for your miniatures. Your miniatures are the show. So I would recommend, for that reason, to use cheap paint. Cheap paint like this. This is acrylic black paint that you can put on without doing any kind of spray if you prefer. But the point of this exercise really is just to state that cheap paint is good for terrain because you're really not going to get up that close to it. Now, once you've got your terrain piece spray painted or painted with just some acrylic black paint, you're going to start with a dry brush technique. And I'm just going to use some very inexpensive Walmart paint that I got. This is just a pewter gray, but you're looking just for a light gray texture. So we're going to put a little bit of this on our palette, just a very little bit. And then I've got a dry brush that I have here, and you can buy these in makeup brush kits. That's what you're looking for, this nice feathery tip to the dry brush. And so what we're going to do is we've got our dry palette here. We're going to get just a little bit of paint on this, and then we're going to basically paint all of it off. We're really going to get most of it off the palette completely, just so you've got just a little bit on here. And then I'm going to be kind of sloppy with this really, and I'm just going to go by and just dry brush everything. And you can go about this a lot of different ways. A lot of people will potentially do a spray paint of some kind with a metallic, you're thinking about lead belcher or something like that. It really depends on the look that you're going for, but I always like to give a nice dusting with my dry brush, and you can see this is not taking me much time at all, and it's already making an immediate impact. And I'm being pretty rough with this, so I'm going to get a little more paint and do the rest of this here, and you'll see a pretty quick impact right away. So now that we've got our first dry brush done, you can see that it's already come to life a little bit, and honestly you could put this on the tabletop right away if you wanted to do that. We are going to go a little further for this tutorial, but you don't have to. I mean, this looks pretty good already, but I'm going to show you a couple other highlights that you can do. This is some white paint that I have. It's acrylic. You can tell it's really old, and I think I took this from my wife's craft cabinet, but the point of this really is to show that you don't have to have nice paint for this type of stuff. So you're going to put a little bit of your white paint out, and you can see it's coming out pretty pretty gross. That doesn't matter, honestly. So you're going to get a little bit. I'm going to use the same dry brush. I'm going to get just a little bit here, and you're going to get most of it off. You don't want much. You want a lot of it gone. And then you're going to come back and use the exact same technique, but you're going to grab some of the highlights, and you're going to see that it picks up the ridges and gives it almost a ghosty type look. So for our next step, we're going to be applying some details and some highlights to our terrain piece. I've got 3 different brushes here, and I'm not going to use all of them. I'm going to show you the difference between these because, number one, this is a really worn brush. I've used it. You can see some of the texture paint's been on here before. You don't have to have a nice brush for terrain at all. You just want to get the paint on there. I've got a nicer one that you can see the tip is much finer. These are all cheap brushes, but I've used these for some miniature painting. And then I've got one that's a little middle of the road. You can see I haven't taken the best care of it, but it was going to serve the purpose for the painting of the frame here that we're going to be using. And the paint that we're going to be using here is the Retributor Armor. Now, I know that I mentioned earlier that we're typically not using an expensive paint, but I want the specific type of color applied to our frame on this terrain piece. So I've got my wet palette here and my terrain kit and my medium level brush that I haven't taken the best care of, but you can absolutely use an old brush if you want. I've got my Retributor Armor here on the wet palette, and I've watered it down just a little bit. You honestly don't have to, but we're going to take that and we're just going to go over the framework of these windows. And you don't have to be particularly neat. You just want to get the paint on there as quickly as you can, especially if you don't necessarily love painting terrain and you just want to get it on the board. So we'll be applying the first coat, and we're going to apply that all to the frames here, over here on the side, and then of course on the inside with those frames. And we'll move on to the next step from there. So now that we have applied the Retributor Armor to the window frame, you can see that there are a couple of different areas where the paint didn't actually apply as much, and I did that intentionally to give it a bit of a weathered look. So if you want to have a more clean and pristine type of a ruined building, if you will, feel free to put on more paint, but I actually like the weathered look of this, and it also doubles to allow me to paint this much faster. So for the next step, we're going to paint the metal pieces here on the outside and on the inside, and for that we're going to use lead belcher. And you can probably use a different type of metallic paint that you want, but for this one in particular I'm using Citadel's lead belcher. Again, if you want to use a cheaper paint, that's completely up to you. It's not really going to matter. I just had this on hand, and for that I put some on my wet palette here, and I've got the really old and nasty brush that I mentioned earlier. We're going to use that because I want to show the difference that I used a nicer brush on the frame, but for these metal pieces I'm really just going to put it on there quite quickly. And you can see that, I may hit a few other areas that I need to clean up later, but honestly, it's not really going to matter. Once it's on the table, very few people are going to see, and you can see that's already coming out pretty good. So now with the lead belcher dry here on the metal pieces, I think that's looking pretty good. And honestly, you could stop right now if you wanted to. Put that on the table. I've also applied some lead belcher to the insides of the destroyed walls just to give it more of a destroyed look and some pop. So at this point, you can do a couple of different things. One, you can add some shade, which we're going to do in the next step. And you can also add some detail. And in this case, they've got some skulls here. I always like to paint these skulls. That's not necessarily a thing that everybody likes to do, but I find that it gives it a bit of a pop and some extra color to it. And for that, we're going to use our Wraithbone paint. And that is something that a lot of people use commonly for skulls and the like, and this is going to be no different. So we're going to apply some Wraithbone here to these skulls. I've got my thinner brush that's a little better than the other brush we used previously on the wet palette. I'm going to apply some of this paint, and you're just going to go over the skulls. It doesn't have to be exact. It doesn't have to be super detailed. So now we're on to the shading step, and for that I'm going to start with the lead belcher areas with the metal, and I'm going to use Nuln Oil for that. Now there's another option. You could also use Agrax Earthshade if you want a dirtier or dingy look. We're going to use that actually for the gold, but for this particular case on the metal I'm going to stick with Nuln Oil. Now I'm going to take our old dingy brush that I had earlier, and I'm going to go straight out of the pot with Nuln Oil. I don't know if that's going to be the best policy, but I find that it's the fastest, and really you just want to, you can put it on your wet palette if you want to, but it's just Nuln Oil. It doesn't necessarily need to look pristine. I've got this as a fairly clean brush, but you really just kind of slop it on. You don't need to be real precise with it. Okay, so you can see the Nuln Oil has dried on our lead belcher, and it's really starting to get that grimy look. We're going to continue that with a different shade, and this time it's going to go on the gold paint with the Retributor armor here. We're going to give it a dingier look, and for that we're going to use Agrax Earthshade. And now you can use Agrax Earthshade on the lead belcher as well to give it a dingier look if you choose, but in this case we're just going to use it on the Retributor armor. So I'm going to go back to the wet palette. I am going back to that on this particular case because it's got an actual color to it. We're going to pull some here, and we're just going to go over the gold, the Retributor armor, and it doesn't have to be neat. You can really put it in anywhere. You don't necessarily want it to pool, but if it does, that's also not a big problem because it can give you a little bit of a weathered look, especially here in the recesses and corners where rain might be hitting it or something like that. So now that our Agrax Earthshade has dried on our gold Retributor armor frame, it's really starting to look dingy. Again, you could apply this to the lead belcher areas if you wanted, or even go back over if you got it a little too dark. I think I'm okay here. I want this to look nice and destroyed and ruined. So the very last shade that we're going to use is going to be on the skulls. We don't want them looking too pristine, and for that we're going to use Skeleton Horde. Now you can use a watered down brown if you want. It really doesn't matter. You just want them to not look so white. And so I put some on our wet palette here. So I'm going to get a little bit, and I did add a little bit of water to it. I don't want it too thick. And you're just going to go over the skulls really, really quickly just to give them one last little bit of shade. And you want to make sure the tops for sure are taken care of. But once that dries, you can do one final coat if you want to. You could go back with some Wraithbone and hit it with a little bit of a dry brush over the top. But if not, this is perfectly serviceable. And at this point, we have a good looking ruin that is ready for the tabletop. I hope this tutorial has been helpful for you and getting you some quick tips to upgrade your terrain to the next level. Do you have your own painting techniques or recommendations? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I'm David the War Boss, and we'll see you next time.